Welcome to the Cardholder Overview Information Session. This session is designed exclusively for the cardholder, which is an employee that currently holds an individual P-card. If you are a card manager, in other words, if you have a department or service center card, please be sure to review the Card Manager Overview session posted at the PCard website, which includes specific criteria for that role. PCard information sessions are offered periodically to select audiences to offer information updates. This session today will include a few detailed slides and then a brief demo. Resources for this session include job aids and other materials posted at the PCard website. We recommend bookmarking the PCard website for future use. All information covered in the cardholder overview is available at the PCard website, including information about the card you hold and what you can and cannot purchase. You'll find processing support job aids. You'll also find bank contact information for reporting fraud or lost cards. You'll also find news and much more. This session includes a review of the cardholder role and the card types available to a cardholder. We'll be identifying cardholder responsibilities, and we'll be introducing the process in Workday to expense the transactions you make with the PCard. As a reminder, this session is just an overview, so you should refer to the PCard website, policy, and available job aids for more specific guidance. So let's start with the role and responsibilities of a cardholder. It is important to note that the cardholder is exclusive to employees who are assigned permanent custody of an individual or get card. The role should not be confused with a card manager, who is the custodian of department or service center P-cards. Since there are currently no get cards in circulation, we'll just cover the individual card, which is issued for the procurement of goods, services, and travel expenses necessary to conduct university business. The standard limit is $5,000 per transaction and $10,000 per cycle, although some cards may be issued with lower or higher limits as authorized by your unit. The individual card is embossed with your name on the card and is only permitted for business or travel expenses for you. The individual card should not be used to procure expenses for other employees or students. Responsibilities of a cardholder include, but are not limited to, reviewing PCard policy and completing required training to ensure use of PCard is appropriate and in compliance with the university's policies. Making appropriate business purchases, noting no personal purchases are permitted on the PCard. If using the PCard for travel, remember that airfare is not permitted on the card and should be procured through the university's contracted travel agency. All travel expenses procured with the PCard must have an approved spend authorization number issued in Workday before use. You should keep the PCard in a secure place. Don't share the full account number through email and immediately report lost or stolen cards. Ensure tax exemption is applied when applicable. Collect an itemized receipt. And starting January 7th, you are responsible for expensing your transactions in Workday. Any transaction made on or after December 25th will be routed to Workday to be expensed. So let's move on to the process with Workday. In current state, you make an appropriate business purchase with your PCard and turn in your itemized receipt to your unit, who in turn reallocates and approves the transaction in PeopleSoft. Ideally, an e-request was issued in advance of that purchase. In future state, again, effective January 7th, you'll make an appropriate business purchase, noting again that if it is for a travel expense, a spend authorization must be approved before the purchase is made. Next, you'll scan an electronic copy of the itemized receipt, and you want to store the scanned file in a location to easily access for the expense report. Within 7 to 10 business days of the purchase receipt date, you must create an expense report in Workday for that transaction. After the expense report is submitted, your unit will approve the transaction in Workday. Let's talk about scanning the receipt. One option is to place the receipt on your local copier and scan to your email address. This will create a PDF image of your receipt that you can store. Another option is to install an app to your mobile device for scanning the receipt. Workday has a mobile app you can consider, which requires some setup before use. Make sure the scanned image of your receipt is readable for audit review. Name the scanned file something you easily can identify when you're ready to upload into Workday. For example, add the merchant name and transaction date to the file name. If you need assistance with your scanning, please see your service center. So now that we've covered the basic steps, let's do a quick demo of the expense report process. For the purpose of our demo, we're going to start with a non-travel transaction. Before we begin, we will need to make sure the transaction we are expensing has all materials ready and accessible. So we'll start off making sure the receipt is scanned and electronically stored. In this case, we're peeking into our share drive to check to make sure we have the receipt. Noting that we took careful effort to name and date the receipt for ease of selection in Workday. Opening our receipt, we make note that there should be a transaction to Muthen and Muthen for $895. Next, we'll log into Workday to begin the process. In Workday, we're going to start by entering Create Expense Report in the search bar, and then we'll click Enter. The search results will offer different expense report options. We're going to select Create Expense Report. This takes you to the expense report information entry page. There are multiple fields that will be pre-populated, for example, company and expense report date. And if you scroll down, you'll see work tags. For example, cost center and balancing unit. These are what were previously referred to as chart fields. All pre-populated items are from your unique setup based on the unit you are employed. If you scroll a little further down the page, credit card transactions appear. For this demo, we are focusing on one transaction, but keep in mind that multiple non-travel transactions can be selected and batched as one expense report. For this demo, we're looking for the transaction for Muthen and Muthen for $895. You can either scroll through the list or use the sorting filter to locate that specific transaction. Let's look for that transaction under Merchant using the filter. Muthen and Muthen, M-U-T-H-E-N. And there we find our transaction. Let's click the box to include. Now that we've selected the transaction, we're going to scroll back to the top to complete a few required fields. Since this is a non-travel transaction, we'll leave the default radio selection called Create New Expense Report. Then we need to enter a memo. This should be a unique reference memo for the transaction or a batch of transaction. Let's type in that memo field, Weekly PCard Expense Report for card 8800. And let's put today's date. Next, we'll select a business purpose. Remember, since this is non-travel, the only selection is non-travel. You can click on the list of options or key in the term if you know it. We're going to scroll down in the work tags section. We're going to leave the defaults and not make any changes. Scrolling back down further to the credit card transaction section, we note the transaction that we've selected, and we're going to click OK. This moves the process into the expense line entry page. Noting the selected transaction will appear on the left side as an expense line. If we were batching multiple transactions, all selected transactions would be listed. Let's continue the process by first attaching the transaction receipt. You can either drag and drop the file or upload by selecting the file from its stored location. Let's go ahead and select an attachment, Jeff. You'll see when selected that multiple attachments can be added for the expense line if applicable. Also, an optional comment can be added to describe the contents of the attachment. Jeff, let's call this attachment software receipt. Next, we'll enter the expense item. Either key in or select from the non-travel options. In this case, we'll key in software to find our selection. You can also search by group or category. Remember, non-travel group selections only. In the memo, we're going to add a general description of purchase. We're going to peek at the receipt to get an idea of what was purchased, and we're going to enter M plus software. We'll scroll down now because we're going to select the appropriate work tags for that transaction. This is where you would change or overwrite the default content. You can either key in or select from a work tag option. If you're not sure what is appropriate to change, see your fiscal office for guidance. The final stage is under item details on the right side of the expense line page. The required field is for a business reason, and we're going to enter software for academic year 2020. No entries needed for the requisition number field. That is exclusive to Service Center cards only. If the transaction needs itemized, for example, to separate tax or alcohol, you can click on the Add button to itemize the transaction, but we're just going to click the Receipt Included checkbox at the bottom. We're going to scroll down a little bit further to enter any applicable comments. We're going to enter supplier in a state that is not tax exempt. Once you're done entering your information, you can click Submit, or you can click Save for later if more work is needed. If you notice alerts or errors, you can click on the alert pop-up to view. However, most are warnings and will not prevent submission. Let's go back to the search bar, Jeff, and create another expense report, this time for a travel transaction. Correct. A travel transaction is processed the same as the non-travel transaction, except for a few differences. When we land on the expense report information page, the first item that is different for an expense report for a travel-related transaction is that we'll select the radio button called Create New Expense Report from Spend Authorization. Noting as a reminder, all travel transactions must have an approved spend authorization before purchase. We can either key in the spend authorization number or select from the applicable options. In this case, we have one ready for selection associated with the conference in Texas. By this selection, the system automatically pulls in the content from the spend authorization for the memo field and the business purpose, while the expense report date will recognize today's date. As we did in the previous expense report, we'll scroll past the default work tags and select the credit card transactions related to this specific spend authorization, noting we would have already verified we had a receipt scanned and stored for the selection of this transaction. In this case, we're looking for two transactions for the Gerontological Society, one for $224 and the other for $230. Let's search by the merchant filters. We have two results, and we're going to go ahead and click both of those transactions. We'll click OK to move to the expense line entry page. The expense line entry is the same as a non-travel transaction, where you will attach a receipt and complete field prompts as we did in the previous demo. Let's go ahead and attach the receipt for the first transaction. and we'll fill in the expense item. In this case, the expense item must be selected from the travel group. So let's do a search for conference registration. And we'll select that. We'll enter a memo to describe specifically what was purchased, which in this case would be conference registration. And then we'll change or alter the work tag. So let's scroll down to consider our options. Again, if you're not certain of the appropriate work tag to select, see your fiscal office. Lastly, we're going to go ahead and click the receipt included at the right. You'll see we have two transactions. If we click on that other transaction, the other one for $224, we would proceed in the same fashion and attach the receipt for that transaction, enter the expense item, right? And then we'll enter the expense item. Let's put conference registration again, yeah. And we'll put a memo and indicate the receipt included. So in this case, we've completed two transactions against one spend authorization with one expense report. If you scroll down further, you can add comments and then you would click submit. This concludes our demo. Let's return back to our slide deck. Next slide, please. There we go. One final reminder for the cardholder is the deadline to complete expense reports for PCard transactions. Due to IRS rules, all expense reports must be processed expediently. The university is setting a turnaround standard of 7 to 10 days from the transaction date. Further, to ensure that all transactions are expense timely, the unit is expected to monitor cardholders' transactions that have not been expensed. In addition, the PCard office will also be monitoring these transactions and will route monthly reporting of unexpensed transactions to each unit's senior fiscal officer. If questions arise after go live, consider the following options for support. That concludes the cardholder overview and demo.